Then a cloud covered the tent of the congregation, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter into the tent of the congregation, because the cloud abode thereon, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle.
In the end, because of the free will offerings and the rare obedience to God, the tabernacle was completed precisely as God designs it. The reward is that God meets with his people close up and personal. Now, we've been talking about overflow of giving from people, but that's one thing. But what about when God overflows with giving? God, the Lord of hosts, Adonai Tsevaot, who spoke the universe into existence. What happens when he shows up? The mere hem of his garment fills the temple. When he shows up, we enter into a new dimension of giving. When the glory, the heavy kavod of the Lord fills the tabernacle, even Moses and later the priests of Solomon can't even stand to be in the same room. They can't bear it, yet they thirst for it. King David wrote about this, how he had seen God in the sanctuary, and how that experience left him longing and thirsting for God as in a dry and parched land where there is no water. He wrote, because experiencing your loyal love is better than life, my lips will praise you. God takes us to the very limits of what we can stand, the very limits of ourselves. And when we taste him there, we see that he is good. And that's what I didn't tell you, but you're next. Then the Lord.
Then the Lord said to Moses, set up the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, on the first day of the first month.
Okay, so now we're going to spend a little time talking about the tabernacle and the mercy seat and the recycling business. What is that tabernacle? The tabernacle is an enclosed sanctuary with only one way in. On entering, one finds first the brazen altar where the blood of sacrificial animals is shed for the remission of sins. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and God gave it to make atonement for our souls. Next is the laver, where the priests wash before entering the inner chambers. For a tent was prepared, the outer one, which contained the lampstand, the table, and the presentation of the loaves. This is called the holy place. And after the second curtain, there was a tent called the Holy of Holies. It contained the golden altar of incense and the Ark of the Covenant covered entirely in gold. So with these things prepared like this, the priests enter continually into the outer tent as they perform their duties. But only the high priest enters just once a year for Yom Kippur, which is coming up soon, into the inner tent, and not without blood that he offers for himself and for the sins of the people. So we look back at the tabernacle from the perspective of the present day. For almost 2,000 years, there's been no temple. There's no longer a system of temple sacrifice, a system that was in place from those early days of the wilderness tabernacle through the first and second temple periods, all the way until the destruction of the second temple in 70 AD by Rome, maybe with a little bit of a break when they were in exile, or maybe they didn't do it when they were being disobedient for a couple of years. But it's roughly about 1,500 years that the question of how sin separates us from God is very much in the forefront of the minds of the Jewish people for 1,500 years. And it may seem archaic today that we need to be purified of sin. Is sin any less an issue today than it was back then? Are we better than those people? Are we different from those ancient people? Just compare Bible history to today's headlines. I think you'll see how the human heart is as corrupt today as it ever was, and in need of something that it can't provide for itself, that will save it, the human heart, from corruption and death. Isaiah tells his brethren, the Jewish people of his day, but your sinful acts have alienated you from your God. The ornate rituals of those ancient days provide an incomplete cleansing from sin, kind of like a covering over. But it also pictures a future, perfect system for removing sin from our hearts permanently, instantaneously, and irreversibly. Now Messiah has come, and the high priest of the good things to come. He entered once for all into the most holy place, not by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood. And so he himself secured our eternal redemption.
All who were willing, men and women alike, came and brought gold jewelry of all kinds, brooches, earrings, rings, and ornaments.
You may know that Jerry and I are in the recycling business. We're going to look at 3 aspects of the recycling business: repurposing, refining, and redeeming. First, in recycling, we talk about how materials can be repurposed. Clothing can be repurposed as insulation. Plastic bottles are repurposed into park benches. Rubber tires, you may not know, are repurposed into artificial reefs. Could it be that God is in the recycling business as well? For example, when you think of all the materials that the people brought for the construction of the tabernacle, did you realize that most of that stuff came from Egypt? It came as gifts offered by the Egyptians to the Israelites as they hastily departed. So this wealth associated with the bitterness of bondage, God repurposed into a holy sanctuary for his presence. He also repurposes people. You may have heard stories of drug merchants, prostitutes, those in the darkest of circumstance, whose lives have been repurposed. I bet you there's stories of that sort in this very room, of the repurposing that God works in our lives. He puts a new spirit in us. He takes away our hearts of stone. He gives us hearts of flesh. He writes his law on our hearts. And as we're repurposed under his care, we are called to our highest purpose, serving others and serving him. Okay, so that's repurposing. Let's move on to refining. Sometimes you bring a circuit board and you bring it to be refined because there's gold in it. It goes through a process of purification. It's exposed to electrolysis, acid, and intense heat. And then the dross and slag are skimmed away, and what do you have? You have pure gold. The substances we know as pure silver and gold are a picture of God, who is not only absolutely pure, but he's also the refiner at work in our hearts, if we allow him. For example, we read that when King Solomon finishes the temple, he places into it the silver and gold articles that belonged to his father David.
When all the work King Solomon had done for the temple of the Lord was finished, he brought in the things his father David had dedicated, the silver and gold and the furnishings, and he placed them in the treasuries of the Lord's temple.
What does this say about God's refining process? Even though King David sinned grievously against God, something pure and precious was yielded from his life for service in the temple. This tells us how in God the eternal in us is yielded up when sin is burnt away. The crucible is for refining silver and the furnace is for gold. Likewise, the Lord tests hearts. If anyone builds on the foundation of silver, gold, wood, hay, or straw, each builder's work will be plainly seen, for the fire, the refiner's fire, will test it, and what sort of work has been done. How has God begun to refine me? I will be overjoyed after all the wood, straw, and hay of my life are consumed in God's refining fire, if so much as a tiny flake of gold leaf remains. God is far from finished with me, I'm the first to admit it, yet I have seen his refining at work. I was blessed to grow up in a wildly creative home with artist parents who raised my sister and me outside the boundaries of convention. They taught me that I could do anything, and their encouragement and joy at my successes gave buoyancy to my life. The prevailing culture taught me to be self-sufficient, to question authority, to find my own way, to define myself by my artistic and my sexual self-expression. Yet, from a young age, I have to confess, I never trusted myself with the enormous responsibility that brought of defining oneself. I hoped that my guesses about my life's purpose were enough to stand on, but too often I missed the mark so dramatically as self-expression tended toward self-indulgence, self-destruction, and an inability to see beyond myself and consider other people. By my mid-40s, I was already keenly aware of the limitations that I brought to a search for meaning. Hormonal mood swings were the mode of the day. Inadequate guesswork, shameful blunders, hurtful missteps, and circular groping, not fit to stand on. There came a point when I was willing to extend a small measure of faith to God. He began to show me himself, and I began to lean on him. He showed me the purpose and meaning of giving back to him for his purposes the life that he gave to me. God is gradually consuming my self-sufficiency in his refiner's fire, leaving the pure element of faith in his sufficiency. Rebelliousness is being consumed in God's refining fire, yielding the pure element of a servant's heart, very much a work in progress. Unforgiveness is being consumed, yielding a willingness to find peace even with the tragedies of life. Fear of death is consumed, yielding a hope of eternity shared with God. Like Yeshua, I do the will of my Father in heaven, allowing him to be the director of the drama unfolding in my heart, and I have the certainty that he will complete the work that he's begun.